Campaign 2020 is sponsored by Wisconsin Hospital Association, Quick Trip, Wisconsin Counties Association, Wisconsin Realtors Association, and Wisconsin Operating Engineers Local 139.
Hear me?
Yes.
Okay.
Will Leverson of Racine is a Republican running in the 66th Assembly District. The election is November 3. Mr. Leverson, welcome to WisconsinEye.
Thanks. I'm glad to be here. Thanks for having me.
I think you have said that policing reform you consider one of your, if not the top issue. Could you explain what, if any, policing reforms you think should be enacted into law, given that there's so many pending in the Capitol, sir?
Yes, thank you for that. What you'll hear me talk about a lot is celebrating and emulating success. So one of the key measures that I'd like to see implemented, especially when we're talking about changing the way that we're spending in law enforcement, is the implementation of non-arresting officers or critical intervention personnel that would intervene in non-arresting matters for youth or persons in mental duress. And what this is aimed at is in providing different interactions or expectations, setting up healthy expectations for those who are most vulnerable when it comes down to the criminal justice system as a whole. We understand that there are school to prison pipelines that are not solely tied to education as much as it is the interactions with youth and law enforcement. For example, you have a inner city youth that may have a fight, but they are not fighting because they're members of gangs or there's organized crime. They're fighting because they're children. And so what we want to do is we want to really distinguish between those that are impacted by their age or by their mental by their mental wellness, so that we don't continue to send people to jail that otherwise really functionally should not be there. I happen to be a person of faith, and I can tell you that in a Christian faith, we do not treat our children as adults, because as our faith tells us that when you're a child, you think and you act as a child does. And so you have a juvenile, or what we used to call a juvenile offender. What we're now calling those people are youth in distress or youth in duress.
What lesson should society take away from the Jacob Blake and the George Floyd incidents, sir? Well,
those two instances are while they're officer-involved incidents, what we can gather is that not everyone is extended the same courtesies as maybe the next person, and it seems to be, when I say seems, nay it is, I know not seems. It truly appears to be that there is a significant disconnect between the application of force in communities overwhelmingly of color, as opposed to other communities around the nation. When you're arrested here in an inner city area, you're a person of color, you may be handled quite harshly as opposed to a non-person of color out in a rural area. And so those are some of those healthy expectations where we heard us talk about that earlier, that we must work to make sure that that everyone has an understanding of what these interactions are going to be. One of the things that I worked on prior to accepting the opportunity to represent Racine is I had spoke with a couple of folks, namely one sheriff, Ernell Lucas. And I was promoting this notion of having an officer's Bill of Rights, which is a set of culture items to set the healthiest expectations between the interactions between law enforcement and civilian alike. For example, promoting that an officer has a right to pull you over if he sees you driving erratically because you may be impaired or otherwise under harm. And so just having those expectations promoted the same way that we do when we have expectations when it comes down to things like smoking or pregnancy or abstinence, those same marketing strategies could be used to culture not only law enforcement but our regular civilians, so that we have completely different, so that we have more professional interactions going forward.
Thank you. Let's talk about the pandemic, because it's hit Racine and your county pretty hard. I guess my first question is, do you support the governor's plan to extend the statewide mask mandate until November the 21st?
I support I truly support a mask mandate that protects people that are impacted truly by this virus. We are now some months into it. We know that there are vaccines possibly on the way. And we also know that at this point in time, we are not dealing with a high 30% killer, the same respiratory killer, the same way that a hantavirus would strike. And so while we are certainly understanding this new novel virus, what we are given, the blessing that we are given, is that not everyone has succumbed to this virus. So one of the examples that again, celebrating emulating success, Virginia as a state has a very aggressive mask mandate, but when you parse out the policy, it does give some folks who are impacted by respiratory conditions that while COVID certainly would probably strike them, the restrictive nature of masks would actually put them at greater harm. So in Virginia, for example, you don't have to disclose what your respiratory condition is, other than if you truly have one, and the mask is actually more restrictive than just your normal practices, that you're not required to wear a face mask. And furthermore, in Virginia, because I see people with face shields, I've seen some without them, and I've heard these other things, but face shields are not adequate face protection. And so just having so what are the masks that we'll have? Because when you get onto a plane, for example, things that you're able to carry around on your person, i.e. the powered ventilators and things, you can't get on a flight with those things. So we need to have a standard across the board, so that once again, we have the expectation, so that, one gentleman isn't wearing a face mask, the other one isn't wearing a face shield, the other one isn't wearing a powered ventilator. What is this going to look like going forward, and who's going to be impacted by this? And the other component to this that I, as a former active duty sailor, would like to hear more about: effective triage and treatment going forward, as opposed to just an arbitrary mask mandate. Okay.
If the pandemic meant that the state government collected, say, $1 billion less in taxes, if you're a member of the assembly, how would you want to make up that shortfall to pay for critical state services?
The only other way that you can make that up is to take a look and see where you're spending money, because it's just like a mom and pop shop, right? Everyone's in damage control mode, different times of year. And so you're always going to have either a surplus or you're going to be at a bit of a deficit. And so, us having $1 billion less in revenue this year isn't any different than having a very poor economic year. There could be many other factors other than a pandemic that could lead to a loss in revenue. And so we just have to be really smart about that, and not, have a knee-jerk reaction and start taking a look at raising, taxes or municipal revenues or I should say, or fines and those sorts of things. You don't need to do that just to make up that shortfall. Just need to see maybe where you are, how best you can, as a business consultant, I'd always advise someone to take a look at, at what's going on around, so you can make the best informed decision and then move forward. Because the things that may have affected us making $1 billion less in a pandemic may have been, in the interim, where we didn't have a lot of economic activity, i.e. people staying home and those sorts of things that didn't have to do with the loss of life or property.
Wisconsin is seeing a record number of hospitalizations from COVID. Mm-hmm. If you're voting on the next state budget as a member of the assembly, do you think hospitals deserve an even greater priority than they may have in the current budget?
Well, once again, that's one of those things where an effective treatment and triage protocol would have really helped out, or a disaster preparedness protocol. That's another thing you'll hear me talk about. We didn't have on the books prior to a pandemic a true pandemic response. We were kind of caught and we were having to fly by the seat of our pants. And so one of the things that would help keep costs down is to make sure that we have effective triage, meaning where the sickest of the sick must go for treatment, and where those who are not sick or otherwise well or not succumbing to any of the COVID conditions, where can they go for treatment so that we keep the costs down in hospitals, or that we give money to those that are having to see the greatest brunt of these patients. We have 72 counties in Wisconsin. All 72 counties aren't seeing the same complexity when it comes to the pandemic. So we had best make sure that we get the monies to those that are most impacted by this.
Well, there was a bill introduced 3 weeks ago, and it says if you're a charity, an organization, or a business, and you follow COVID-19 protocols, you could not be sued over COVID-19. Is this a bill you could vote for, Mr. Leverson?
That sounds a bit like a sort of guesswork there, and not on your behalf, on the folks that put together that legislation. You can't. COVID is a tricky thing. We're understanding now, and this is not to regurgitate national commentary, but we're understanding that there is a slight chance that maybe some of the unfortunate deaths that we have seen come from COVID, that they may have pretty much been preempted or caused by the pre-existing condition that COVID itself did not help. So a lot of what you'll hear me use as an analogy for COVID are these same complexities that happen with something like an immunocompromised disease like HIV, where at some point you're going to have a secondary infection that may or may not impact you greater than the immuno condition that you had. And so I couldn't in good conscience say that someone could sue someone because they caught they had this immunocompromised disease. They came to my shop, and because we were in some, we didn't have the greatest cleanliness, that somebody caught a flu virus and they died because, someone in my store was, coughing and didn't have themselves protected. I wouldn't want to be sued because of something that I couldn't control. We cannot control COVID. We cannot do that. The only thing that we can do is to best understand this, keep the healthy of us moving, keep the sickest of us safe, and get an understanding moving forward of what treatment for this virus is going to be moving forward. But to penalize someone for a biological imperative of nature, man, we did not create this virus. There are going to be many more. We are humans. We have dealt with these things since we've been biological creatures on this planet. And so we cannot begin to start saying that you are responsible for this contagion that you can't control. The only thing you can control is your own, the same way that we do with CBR attacks in the military, with time, distance, and shielding. That is the only way that we can work in this solution here, is the time that it's going to need to understand it, the distancing that we're in now, and the shielding, which is what we have our face masks. That's as best as we can do. Anything outside of that, we are putting ourselves at a great disservice.
States around Wisconsin are increasingly legalizing medical and recreational marijuana. What's your position?
I am for both responsible personal use and absolutely for prescribed medicinal use. As a veteran that gets serviced by the VA, I can tell you, as someone that takes naproxen, who has a back condition, I thought I was fine. I'm 39 years old, man. I went into the doctor here recently, and my doctor told me, she says, "Hey, I see that you're taking your naproxen because your kidneys are starting to take a hit. You can't continue on the same regimen. We're going to have to find you something else for your back." I know that medicinally, many medications that aren't medicinal marijuana have been prescribed for years. My dad had a back problem. He'd take ibuprofen. But what do we know now? Ibuprofen will wreck your stomach. And so what we need to do is find the healthiest, safest alternatives that have a higher threshold, a higher quality of life than what our current prescription medicine climate is now, because we have a lot of things that hurt people instead of help them. And medicinal marijuana, outside of the recreational use, you're talking about people who are medicating using the safest method that they have available to them. When it comes down to recreational marijuana, I was endorsed by NORML. And it wasn't because of some personal use thing. It was because we had a responsible conversation on the different aspects of this legalization conversation. Because you have people that are going to look like me, sir, that have been negatively impacted in the criminal justice system because they were on the wrong side of capitalism 5 years before, this commodity was able to be sold legally. What we must do is we must do maintenance to those that have been negatively impacted by the recreational component of these marijuana charges, get that cleaned up while working toward responsible personal use. We are not saying, I don't want people to use marijuana any differently than you can drink a beer now. I can't drink a beer in my car. I don't expect to smoke a joint in my car. I can't just go cracking open all the beers over in the park, and I wouldn't expect to go smoke all the joints in the park. But I do expect and want people to have personal responsible use within their own personal spaces that aren't in public, because it's a silly reason as a business consultant, sir, and as someone that loves to help people, businesses make money. It's a silly thing to not have a revenue stream just because we don't have the tools available in our own efforts to get the deal done. That's a silly reason not to make money.
Do you support the governor's plan for a People's Maps Commission to draw the next set of congressional and legislative districts?
Sir, that's the other thing that's affected my community. I have people that sound and have the mind like Tony Evers that tell my community that fair maps are the keystone issue. Fair maps are more than warranted. I'll tell you that the most frustrating thing being a candidate here isn't, knocking doors and having a wonky district. It's the fact that my mother lives in the city of Racine, and just because of someone's poorly drawn map, my mother can't vote for me. She's literally just on the other side of a district. My thing is common sense approaches. Okay. The 66, when I was a child, I literally moved up to Wisconsin when P-TECH was being recalled. And so the 66 used, even though that was a state Senate seat, but the 66 used to be like the entirety of the city of Racine, which was far more straightforward. And we didn't gain anything. We didn't gain a rep, and we didn't lose anything. What we lost were voting populaces in our city to vote for the representation that immediately impacts them. My mother lives in Ed Hipsch's district. Ed Hipsch is a candidate from Kenosha. Just because she lives on Durand, which is still in Racine, she's still in the city. She's not in like Elmwood. She's not in like a village. Nope, she's in Racine. But just because of someone's poorly drawn map, she can't vote for me. So while it is an important issue, my first and foremost, paramount above all else, are safer homes and streets in our states. If we can get a representative map done over these next couple of years, good deal. But that's not my first order of business.
But let's talk about property taxes. They're high in Wisconsin, so local governments have lived with caps and limits on property taxes for more than 20 years. If you're elected and voting on the next state budget, would you vote to continue those caps and limits on property taxes on local governments?
Boy, I hate that, because you're a business guy that's earmarking things or limiting the growth there. So no, I don't want to start telling people what they can't do with property taxes, because you got to raise capital in order to make a city run. What I would like to see implemented, and this is something that was missing from a vaunted fiscal conservatives' efforts, okay, is to use any surplus monies or any of these monies that we're getting, especially in this stopgap in this pandemic, to take a look at maybe buying down or otherwise trying to lower property tax burdens in some of these areas where it's incredibly high, like a city like Racine. Boy, if there was some poverty tax sort of aversion program that we look at some of these areas and say, hey, there's no reason why, just because you live 5 miles inside of a city that you have to spend $1,000 to $3,000 more in taxes just because your zip code. That's silly. But I don't want to handcuff municipalities from doing what they see best in order to operate. What I don't want to see are skyrocketing property tax burdens because we don't know how else to raise revenue, if that makes sense. So the sort of the same thing that we mentioned about not wanting to raise sales taxes just to make up a shortfall. I don't want to see continuing skyrocketing property taxes to make up those same shortfalls.
Well, do you want to then give local governments the option perhaps of a local half-cent sales tax so they won't have to rely so heavily on property taxes?
Ooh, boy, that's a difficult one. I'll tell you that I'd like to give more leeway in the realm of property taxes than I would in a municipality or even a county government to have a sole control over sales tax. Because what you would maybe then have, and I shouldn't say maybe, you would run into an instance where because of the lack of adequate spending disciplines, you'll have someone with a knee-jerk reaction raise sales taxes very high, and then we'll have the same osmosis of people that say, hey, I don't want to live here where the sales tax is high. I'm going to move away. And so now we have a double loss of revenue. We don't have a paying customer in property tax in the municipality, and we don't have someone paying a higher sales tax. So I would definitely want to take a look at an organization like the Wisconsin Economic Development Corporation there, and maybe having a 72 county panel put together to take a look at moving forward how we're going to raise revenue that doesn't sound like skyrocketing taxes everywhere. I am very leery of that. I want to give all the control as best as possible to local municipalities, but that sales tax, we might have to really rein that in and keep control at a state legislative body, as opposed to, you're going to have to do one of the two. I'd rather municipalities have control over their property taxes to make themselves competitive as opposed to sales tax. Sales tax is a bad thing.
Last year, the governor wanted to raise the gas tax to stabilize how we pay for highways and bridges. Could you consider raising the gas tax?
No. We already have skyrocketing fees for the registration of vehicles and such. I don't want any more raising costs for areas like Racine or Beloit or Oshkosh or Appleton or any of these areas that while they may not be destitute, there's certainly a lot of people that are fixed incomes that cannot incur any other hikes. They just can't, or they'll have to make the decision to move. I don't want the brain drain or the people drain in Wisconsin anymore. We have to get responsible with what we're doing. And no, we had Scott Walker that did not take any of that vaunted surplus money and do right by anyone by fixing these roads. Now I have in the city of Racine, we have road maintenance everywhere, and it's an eyesore, man. And so no, I would not want a hike in a gas tax to pay for roads. Something that, man, and I'll probably get killed for this, but I am now starting to come around to the likelihood that we may need some version of a toll road along some of our thoroughfares in the state. Now, I don't want that to happen. But if you're asking me, what would I rather have? People that are on the road, just like home ownership. It's sort of that burden of proof is that if you're on the road, then you have the means to maintain your vehicle and that you have the means to, pay for gas and those sorts of things. Okay. So what I would say is if we were to implement a toll structure, that it wouldn't affect, as long as we do it the right way, that it wouldn't affect everyday workers who have those lower ends of those income. It would really only affect those that have the means to travel, or otherwise the means to get around. If you're able to afford buying the iPasses and all of that, then you probably have the money, honestly, to help pay for that. So that's a part of that. Those that have a means or those that have a little bit well-to-do paying for the use for other people. Okay. That may be the most responsible way that we can do it. Honestly, that doesn't sound like everyone paying more in the sales tax.
Okay, we only have a couple of minutes left. Just two questions quickly. If a school district or a local government wants to have a major public works project, should they have to consider give a preference to Wisconsin businesses?
Yes, absolutely. There's no reason why. I mean, you buy local, and buying local is within the bounds of the state of Wisconsin. So absolutely, I don't see any reason why We would want to help out the 18th largest economy to our south in Illinois by providing contracts and employment. There's a lot of teachers that come up from Northern Illinois that teach our students. And that's something, once again, that takes away from the lives and livelihoods of so many people here in Wisconsin. There's that one graphic that I love that people use where it says, like, the monies from different communities. Like, for example, a black dollar remains in the black community for X amount of time. Well, our Wisconsin dollar doesn't remain in our state for very long because we have so many different outside influences coming in and taking our money, and they go back home. Those folks that live and work in Northern Illinois, they come on these projects, they build these homes, they take their money, go spend it right down to the 18th largest economy in the world. That needs.
We've only got about a minute left. Could you quickly summarize differences between you and your opponent on November 3?
Yes, absolutely. Greta Neubauer, when you take a look at not her voting record, but just the things that she's authored, she's a very niche sort of person. LGBTQ issues are important, and so are environmental issues, but they are just very small microcosms of the larger body that we have to represent. And so that is the one main difference, that Greta Neubauer, as a child and person who comes from a position of privilege, cannot adequately leverage and liaison for an inner city area that is not affluent like Racine. Racine is not Waukesha, Racine is not West Dallas, and it's not Walworth County. And so the Greta Neubauers of the world cannot speak for the everyday person inner city. And that is where I come in. I speak for nearly every impacted community that we have here, whether it be a minority, veteran, a father, a person that I'm not handicapped, but I do have a back impairment. And so there's a lot that comes out of our campaign that is a very people-focused campaign. That is why we have our Focus 4 from safety, housing, wages, and mental wellness. Our platform is going to help people. Greta does not have a platform.
Okay. Will Leverson of Racine is a Republican running in the 66th Assembly District. The election's November 3. Will, thank you for talking to WisconsinEye, and drive safe.
Not a problem. Thank you. I appreciate it.
Campaign 2020 is sponsored by Wisconsin Hospital Association, Quick Trip, Wisconsin Counties Association, Wisconsin Realtors Association, and Wisconsin Operating Engineers Local 139.